I learn a lot from white scholars. I'm surrounded by white scholarship. I'm surrounded by white knowledge. I'm surrounded by white books and white philosophers. And that means the knowledge that comes out of me is white and very Eurocentric. So I have to actually go and consume knowledge that is different so that knowledge that is different can actually come out of me.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
We all know first impressions count. Yet, rather than putting their best foot forward, most big-hearted, well-intended coaches are unknowingly starting their relationships with their prospective Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color clients off on the wrong foot by making statements such as the following. No, 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 no. Where are you from originally? Wow, your English is so good for a Black person. Your skin tone is not dark enough. Are you sure you're from Africa? We have a scholarship program to support people just like you. These subtle yet gut-punching microaggressions can feel like death by 1,000 cuts for a person of color as they are continually reminded they don't belong. That is why I've put together a training called Microaggressions 101, where I help you to understand how to hold safer spaces in your online coaching business that will see you serve a wider and more racially diverse audience. For instant access, head over to anigishuru.com/LT. That's anigishuru.com, GICHURU.com/LT. The LT is for live training, and you can find this link in the show notes. You are absolutely going to love my next guest. She is a wealth of information. Please set aside an hour, sit down, and just listen. And then when you're done, come back with a notebook and paper and write down what you're hearing. Because for me, I will be going back. I will be re-listening to this because there's just so much that was jam-packed in this 1 hour, and it wasn't even enough. And so she is absolutely going to come back again, and we're going to discuss even more because post the conversation, when I stopped recording, we got into other topics and she was like, oh, I should have spoken about this. And she has to come back. And so let me tell you about her. Her name is Kathomi Gatwiri, Dr. Kathomi Gatwiri. She is an associate professor at ARC, DECRA fellow in the Faculty of Health at Southern Cross University here in Australia, in Queensland. She is the president of the peak body Australian Women and Gender Studies Association and a practicing psychotherapist. Kathomi is one of Australia's leading Afro-diasporic scholars whose award-winning interdisciplinary research investigates the intersecting topics of racial trauma, belonging, Blackness, and migrant-hood. She is the founder and director of Healing Together, a service that provides accessible, culturally sensitive therapeutic support for racially minoritized people impacted by trauma. Without further ado, here is Dr. Kathomi Gatwiri. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Represented Podcast. I am super excited today to have a very special guest with me. We've been having a conversation for a long time to get to hear. Kathomi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Annie. I'm so glad we could make it work.
Yes, yes. Your area of work is something that I have been drawn to so much. I think I first discovered you on LinkedIn and I was like, how do I not know this human? How have I been here for this long and not, come across your work? And since then, I've been following along and just learning so much. But I would love us to begin by you sharing with us, how did you get here? Doing this work of, you're a doctor, you're a professor, researcher, psychotherapist, and many other hats that you wear. How did you arrive here?
That's a good question. By accident is the simple answer, to be honest with you. I didn't start out thinking, oh, I want to do a PhD. I want to become an academic. I think this life pretty much chose me. So, and I also didn't start out thinking I was going to become a race scholar or I was going to focus on this area of work. It just came organically from the work that I was already doing. So when I arrived in Australia, I was doing a master's of psychotherapy, which I completed. And I very quickly thought I am too young for this work. Like there's a maturity I think that's needed to become a good therapist. There's a mileage, there's life experiences that are well beyond a 22-year-old,
Right.
and I just decided, even though I spent all that time learning about psychotherapy, I was going to give it a pause and I was going to grow up first. So that was a big decision. Along that time, I was offered an opportunity to go and do a PhD, and I took it. I did not know actually I had a PhD in me until someone said, "Do you want to do it?" I was like, well, I'll try, but I can't promise anything.
Right.
So I think some of those opportunities, you don't know you have it in you until someone gives you the opportunity to just go and do it. So I was a scared 23-year-old trying to figure out how is this even done. I didn't really know anybody in my personal life or in my family who had done this. So I took the opportunity. I think the rest has been history. In terms of focusing on this area of work, I would say pretty much it was very accidental. My PhD was not on anything like this. It was actually on childbirth trauma and obstetric fistulas and, something completely different, right? But when I started writing more about experiences of women, particularly Black women in labor and their childbirth experiences, they said, well, we can't actually talk about those experiences without talking about our experiences as Africans and our experiences as Black women. Like it's almost like that takes a secondary conversation for us, because even as we enter the theater, as we enter, those childbirth moments for us, we are seen a particular way and therefore treated a particular way. So even though I didn't go seeking to learn about race, every time I talk to my community, that's where they started and that's where they ended. And they said, well, what are you going to write about this? And how are you going to write about this? So it was the drawing of the community to talk about that alongside all the other aspects that they felt was important. And that's how I found myself honed in into writing about the experiences of Africanness, of Blackness, of migrant-hood, or wrapped into one. And then about 5 years ago, I returned to psychotherapy when I felt I had enough maturity and enough, academic rigor to be able to support people who wanted help in that particular way. So that's a long intro into how we got here.
No, that's not long at all. You can keep going because I have, questions are just coming up as you're sharing that. Was there something in particular that drew you to psychotherapy? Was it something growing up that you felt drawn to that particular area of study?
I would say probably mum had an affinity to, she was a social worker, she's a gender specialist, and she spent a long time counseling women who were living in domestic violence. So that was my first introduction to that area of work. And my first degree was actually in social work. And in social work, there's a lot of therapeutic work that goes into that profession. So I did think about if I wanted to specify to do any kind of specialization, it would be to work with individuals to support them to recognize their agency in one way or another. So I would say that personal introduction, just observing curiously what my mum was doing with her work, and also going to university and being introduced to this area of work where I thought, wow, that's very interesting. Um, but my approach to therapy has really changed after living in Australia for so long because now my focus is not just about the individual, it's also about getting the individual to understand the systems within which they live so
Yeah.
that we are not just telling a person to change themselves when the systems around them are the things that have made them be who they are and the patterns that they've adapted to cope. So it's a interrelation of the two, I would say.
I love what you've just mentioned there about, somebody having that historical context, because especially when you're looking for somebody to support you, and,
Mm,
there are all sorts of people who are qualified degree-wise and so on. But if you go to somebody and you both come from different backgrounds, for them to get to the core of what the issue is, or for them to best be placed in a position to
mm,
support you without having that lived experience or that cultural knowledge,
mm,
makes it so much more difficult. And the central theme that came up as I was preparing for our interview, Kathomi, was the word decolonization. That came up a
mm.
bit. And for someone who may not fully understand this term, could you describe that for us and perhaps what it means in the context of your work?
Okay. So I'm very, very aware that the term decolonization is everybody's cup of tea at the moment. It's in everybody's mouth, it's in everybody's writing, it's everywhere. It's just like the way we've now colonized the word intersectionality, So it's decolonization is really the act, the very present act uh, of undoing, unlearning colonial, of removing colonial remnants from our brains, from our bodies, from our actions, from our everyday lives and relationships, right? So if we are to imagine ourselves as swimming in the ocean, for example, as a metaphor, and the ocean is the colonial context, and we are all immersed in the water. We are all swimming in the water. Some of us are better swimmers than others. Some of us are drowning at the back. Some of us are just trying to just float, right? So if we are to think about colonization as the water, where all of us are born into, bathing in, swimming in, decolonization is the very act of trying to get to the shore, trying to get outside of the water and trying to exist outside of that big ocean context where all of us are swimming. So, and the ocean is in the curriculums that we are taught, it's in the music that we listen to, it's in the media that we consume, it's in the books that we read, it's everything around us, anything and everything around us. So we are swimming in it every day, collecting colonial messages about who we are, collecting, colonial facts, about who we are, and being sold the illusions of those messages as if they were facts about us. So decolonization is really the gut-wrenching work of trying to swim to the shore and remain there and undo the learnings, undo the actions, and try to recreate a different way of knowing and existing in the world outside of that, ocean that we are all swimming in.
What a powerful description there. And as
Mm,
sharing that, what's coming up for me is
hmm
decolonizing is not just for those who have been colonized. Decolonization is for everyone because
Yeah.
it has shaped who we are as human beings, how we think, how we move, how we act. And so it has shaped us, our belief systems, and the humans that we are. And so decolonization is not for a certain group of people who were colonized, but it's for everybody.
It is for everybody, more so for the people who exist within the colonizing mentality, actually. So I would say
Right.
decolonization, just like Bell Hooks talks about, she says feminism is for everybody, right? And I would say decolonization is for everybody. It is both for those who colonize and those who have been colonized, because a colonizing mindset cannot colonize without being colonized itself, you know? So, and to colonize, you have to assume a colonial mindset, colonial view, a colonial way of being. So, more so than the person who is colonized, the person who has a colonizing mentality also has to do the work of rethinking how they relate to the world and how they relate to other people in the world, and almost undoing this hierarchy that we've constructed as the way that we live our lives. Who is better? Who is this? Who is that? Who sits at the top of the hierarchy within this colonial context that we live in, and undoing that bit by bit. So I would say we're all swimming in the water, and we are all, colonial beings in one way or another. Some of us are, like I said, the journey is a bit more different. We're trying very hard to swim to the shore.
Yes.
And others are in the middle of the ocean. They're never gonna make it to the shore, So it's difficult work, but I think it's necessary work for us to connect really to the versions of ourselves that can exist outside of that colonial mentality.
Yes, and there's a post that you shared on LinkedIn a little while ago, and you were like, enough with talking about decolonization. Action is what is required. And
Mm.
I'm wondering, what kind of action do you feel is required? And by who? Is it all of us? But what would that action look like, especially once people have reached the stage of awareness, the stage of realization, oh my goodness, we've all been sucked into this ocean. We're living in this ocean. How do we begin the act of taking action? What would that look like?
That's a good question. So, like I said earlier, the very first of decolonization is recognition. Recognition that we are in the ocean swimming, and we are swimming in waters that have very strong currents. And it's just much easier to be carried along with the water than to try to swim upshore. So that's the very first act of recognition of decolonization is recognition. The second act is, being able to make a conscious decision about swimming backwards. So what that means is, here I'm thinking about, an African philosophy called Sankofa. It's a Ghanaian philosophy that means going back to that which belongs to you, or, going back to that which you've forgotten. So the very act of decolonization is making active, consistent choices about returning to yourself. Because what colonization does, it strips you of yourself and imposes other versions that, people think are better, more sophisticated, more civilized, all those things. So it's making those conscious decisions. And those little choices could be as small as, who is teaching me? Who are my teachers in life? So if you just actively today, after you listen to this podcast, to just go to your home and look at your home library and look at who is teaching you. I just want you to look at how many Black scholars that you've got there.
Yeah.
I want you to see whether you've got any disabled scholars. I want you to see whether you've got any LGBT scholars. I want you to see whether you've got any Indigenous scholars. Who is teaching you outside of your own worldview? And be very open about learning from people who have different experiences from you. Now, I know this sounds simple, but it's one of the most difficult things to do, to be able to hold the experiences of other human beings as if they were just as accurate and valid as our own. And so for me, it was just mostly going, I learn a lot from white scholars. I'm surrounded by white scholarship. I'm surrounded by white knowledge. I'm surrounded by white books and white philosophers. And that means the knowledge that comes out of me is white and very Eurocentric. So I have to actually go and consume knowledge that is different so that knowledge that is different can actually come out of me. So that would be very particular. And then the other thing is not just reading, but also making conscious decisions about interrogating your relationship with power. One of the things that colonial mentality does is to lure people with power and what that power can do so that you can climb the hierarchy of white supremacy, and you can climb the hierarchy of patriarchy, and you can climb the hierarchy of life, And it doesn't often say if you get this power, it'll be this and this and this. It is often if you get this power, you don't get to be like that and that and that. It is who you stop being like, not who you become when you're given access to power. So the conversation is, how do you change your relationship with power? Because a lot of people get power to colonize, to disempower, to disrespect, to take away from, to colonize, and to also climb the power so that they can be just like the colonial master on this other side. So when we think about how we've been sold the idea of power is you go to school, you accumulate things, you earn this so that you don't fill the blanks. So decolonial way is that if I have access to power, how can I use that to be able to distribute wealth, to be able to distribute knowledge, to be able to form different relationships that are empowering towards me. And finally, it's about integration into community. When one of the things that the colonial works does so well is to separate people, to sell you the idea that you exist in the world as an individual, that you can make it as an individual. That's why we hear all those stories about being a self-made millionaire. We love those stories because there's an illusion that you as an individual, you carry your own power, wealth, capacity, and everything that you need to be able to succeed in the world. What a decolonial mentality talks about is we exist integrated with other people. We exist in relationships with other people. Even if you're a self-made millionaire, you probably had someone who cooked for you. You also had someone who talked to you. You had someone who you brainstormed ideas with. You had someone who gave you, a loan here and there. You did not make it on your own. So the separationist idea of colonial thinking gets you to think you made it on your own, and therefore if you succeed, you get to live life on your own, completely separated from the suffering of other people and completely separated from what other people need. So it's about returning again to relationships and returning to community, in those intentional practices. So I can share more, but I think those 4 are a good place to start.
Wow, I feel like I need to be taking notes. I'm like, I need to go back and replay this and just let that sink in because there's just so much. You're opening my eyes, and I'm sure the person who's listening as well, to look at this relationship of power and this individualism that is being brought into play here. Yes, I've had that statement. We love it, self-made millionaire. How did you do that? And people aspiring to that. But of course, they didn't do it on their own. Of course, there was relationships. There were people there. There were, it was not done on their own. And just going back to now how your work is so grounded in this decolonizing methodologies that attempt to develop, transformative knowledge about, and for those who have been assigned categories, you speak about that in terms of your work. Those who have been assigned categories of difference. Could you just help us understand that a little bit? Just peel the layers for us in terms of categories of difference.
Mm. So to have categories of difference, you need to have a standard of what is considered default and the norm, and every society has a different standard. So, for example, in Kenya, probably the standard would be for someone who is able-bodied, straight, Christian, living a particular life, and that's the standard. And if someone falls on either side of that standard, then they're assigned a particular difference, right? So if they have a disability, if they've chosen not to have children, if they're widowed, if they're even parenting differently, every society constructs its own line in the sand. And then the people who choose to exist on either side of the line are assigned what that difference is. So, for example, in Australia, the line in the sand of what's seen as normal is, to be white, to be straight, often to be Christian, even though we don't like acknowledging that very much. And so it means if you're not white, it means if you have a disability, if you're a woman, if you're a migrant, there are all these categories that are assigned to you because they do not meet the threshold of what it means to be at the center. So, for example, when people think of who an Australian is, they will not be thinking probably about you and me. Why? Because there's already so much consumption of the knowledge of who an Australian is and how they look like. So who came up with that line? So these are the unspoken rules of who creates the standard and the default system that then categorizes people. So depending on how farther away you are from the line, the more marginal your experiences are. So, for example, you could be a woman, but you're white. Therefore, you're closer to the line.
Yeah.
So you could be a Black person, but you're male and you're Christian and you're straight, so you are closer to the line. But so as you move farther and farther away from what that line is, the difference that you're assigned in society brings with it a compounding of marginality. And that's where my interest is in terms of work, to look at who is assigned a category of difference and how that category then influences their everyday experiences. So the category that I focus on a lot is migrant-hood and blackness, and in particular, the form of blackness that is Afro-blackness, because blackness is also not ranked the same. And non-whiteness is also not ranked the same. So we know there's a lot of violence even within communities of color. So for me, it's about looking at that particularity of Afro-blackness and how that particular category of difference influences how we live here, how we experience being here, the relationships we have, the pain that we navigate, the marginality that we navigate, and all that good stuff within that.
You said that not all Black is the same. Can you just unpack that a little bit more, because there's obviously the Afro-blackness, there's the African Black people, but then there is Blackness from other parts of the world. And so could you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure can. I'll be brief here because I do not have a lot of knowledge on extensive forms of Blackness elsewhere, but I can talk about those layers. So if we're going to think about white supremacy as a structure, we can see who is assigned the standard. Obviously, the white person is the standard and default, again, in a white supremacist context, right? And depending on how far away you are from whiteness, it means that in the hierarchy of whiteness, you assume lower and lower ranking within the hierarchy. So, for example, if you're white passing, but you're not white, you're very proximate to whiteness. If you're mixed race, if you look white, if people can't assign you a racial category, if you're racially ambiguous, you are probably going to dance very differently to that line, very close to that line. Mm-hmm. So the lesser and lesser and lesser you are to that white line, the more your experiences become racialized and fraught with other microaggressions, even within communities that fall outside of that line. So for example, I speak often about anti-Black racism, yes, rather than just racism as a whole, because we know that even within communities of color, there is so much anti-Blackness. And where is that anti-Blackness? It's, farthering along from the line we talked about earlier. And remember the conversation I also had with you earlier about the relationship to power. So if people feel closer to the vault in the middle, they feel more powerful. And there's also that sense of who do we have power over? That's the conversation I was trying to have earlier. Because we are higher in the threshold, we are higher in the hierarchy, it makes us feel good because there's someone below us. You're not really thinking about, why do I need to have power over somebody? It just feels good simply because at least I'm not, finish the sentence. So like I said, power sells you the idea of who not to become, not who to become. And therefore that really changes the conversations of how even communities of color relate to who they perceive to be below them in the hierarchy of whiteness. So, and then that brings in a lot of anti-Blackness in the communities. And that's why a lot of these communities for us are not safe for Black people. Even when we say communities of color, some of them are not very safe. So I think there is power in naming specific communities, like saying Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, because those communities are not also ranked the same in the terms of safety that they offer us against the onslaught of white supremacy.
Absolutely. You have described that just beautifully in terms of just breaking down the layers, the closeness, the proximity to that line, to power, what power tells you you are or you're not, and kind of, getting away from that definition, or that wanting to be viewed in a different way, or who am I above? It's just so interesting how you've really unpacked that.
And also Black people, it's not just communities of color, also Black people can internalize this desire to be closer to the line. Like that's why we talked about decolonizing at the start, because a colonial mindset sells you the illusion that if you get closer to the line, by the way you speak, by the way you dress, by abandoning yourself, by rejecting yourself, by abandoning your people, you will be recruited you will come closer to the line, and you will have access to more opportunities, more power, more relationships, and things like that. And sometimes that requires self-betrayal. It requires community betrayal. It requires so much self-sabotage, because you can't disconnect yourself from your own blackness with a desire to be more proximate to whiteness without doing things that are really, really psychologically damaging to yourself, right? There's a level of cognitive dissonance that has to happen there. So even Black people can participate in anti-Black rhetoric, again, as they chase the proximity to where they think power is,
Yes.
which often in this country is whiteness.
Wow, Kathomi, goodness me. Oh, and so you spoke about your area of research, Blackness, Africanness, migrant-hood in Australia. What are some of the discoveries that you're making as far as racial traumas related to identity and belongingness? What are the discoveries that you're beginning to see?
A lot, but also unsurprising at the same time. So I'll go back to the point that I've made just now about Black people participating in their own devaluation and in their own inferiorization, either as they are trying super hard to be able to get closer to the line, and part of what I'm seeing is twofold. There's that active participation in devaluation, where people, it's interesting because where some of my research shows me where people make very clear decisions about who they marry so that they can have mixed race children, which then gives them more proximity to the line, or where they choose to work, or where they choose to live because they go, that suburb has got too many migrants. I don't want to live there. I want to be able to live in this other place. Or even when you walk down the street and you gaze at the eyes of another person and they dart away because they're like, oh, you're reminding me that I'm this person and I don't want to be reminded I'm working too hard to get close to the line, and you're just offering a mirror that I'm not ready to look at, right?
Yeah.
So there's those subtle acts of devaluing our own blackness to be able to accrue the points of whiteness. And I think sometimes this is done so unconsciously because it's actually an outcome of trauma, and it's an outcome of swimming in the ocean with very strong currents. So if you do not have a critical thought around, why am I changing my name? Why am I changing my accent? Why do I feel funny when I'm around other Black people in the organization? Why am I uncomfortable that they're hiring more Black people in the organization? If you're not unpacking all of that, then you are swimming with the currents that we talked about earlier. It's not necessarily often the fault of an individual. It is about looking at the system that that person is living in. So, and how, coming to my second point, how they make these really interesting decisions as a way to cope with the onslaught, either of racism or marginalization. So sometimes the devaluation and the proximity and the rejection of their own blackness is also a coping mechanism, because if I reduce and curate my blackness as much as possible, it'll also reduce experiences of racism and racialization towards me. So if I speak a particular way and marry a particular person, and I'm not saying people don't fall in love, people of course fall in love, and you know, I'm talking more about those very conscious decisions about reducing the visibility of your own blackness. So that's one. And that's interesting. I often struggle about how to write about that because I can actually understand why people make those decisions, because it's a way of trying to reduce systemic violence towards themselves. If I'm closer to the line, then I'm less likely to experience the violence that the people at the bottom of that line experience. So it's almost like self-preservation in a way, but it is also self-devaluation and self-sabotage. So people existing within that threshold of self-preservation, but to preserve, you also have to self-destroy, which is fascinating. The other discovery is people talking to me often about the concept of racial fatigue, which is, existing in a colonial context is hard. Existing in a white majority context as a Black person is very exhausting on the body. Why? Because it is the everyday micro and macro assaults of racism and microaggressions. Some of them are very subtle, some of them are unintentional, and some of them are very loud and bold and big, from the politicians naming us and labeling us and criminalizing us, making it harder for us to form good relationships with everyday Australians, to the micro practices that hinder our belonging in community. Like, it's much harder to date, to find good partners. It's much harder to find good housing. It's much harder to reach a particular place in organizations and be afforded certain level of leadership authority. It is just much harder. And I'm not saying it's not hard for others. I'm saying it's much harder for communities that live within a racialized context. And so the fatigue of everything feeling like, oh God, I don't know what I'm going to face today. I don't know who's going to tell me to go back to where I came from today. I don't know who is going to tell me my English is good. I don't know who is the random person who is going to try to touch my hair and my children today. I don't know who is going to ask me when I'm going back. Like the anticipation of racial violence, even when it's acute or overt or covert, is a very real psychological burden on Black psyche. So you're walking out every day, and to my third point, hypervigilant. You're hypervigilant, looking around. I had someone tell me the other day that even when they go to a supermarket or a shop and they don't buy anything, if they walk out of the shop without buying anything, the level of anxiety they feel just walking out of the shop, because they go, well, I feel like I this need to just open my bags as I'm walking out for people to not see.
You've said something that is so true. For me, it is when I do the self-checkout at the grocery and it asks you, do you need a receipt or not?
Of
I
course.
always say I need a receipt because
Of course.
just in case anything happens and I cannot prove that I have paid every single time. And it always dawns on me, because obviously I do this, but it always dawns on me. That's just something as a Black person I do because it's just a mechanism. That's just how I'm wired.
That's right. And you need to constantly have proof on you
Yes.
that you're not a bad person, that you're not here to steal things, that you're not a criminal, that you're actually a good person. So just the fatigue of having to prove every day that you're a good person, because you're counteracting the dominant narratives that you could potentially be not a good person, is what creates this fatigue. And as a therapist, I can see how this then manifests in very real psychosomatic symptoms. Black people often talk about constantly feeling bloated, constantly struggling with psychosomatic pains every day, anxiety, depression, and all those things. And sometimes, when I think about this, is that the symptoms of racial trauma are so similar to symptoms of, say, depression or anxiety, that really sometimes we're medicating people for diseases that they do not have. They're just experiencing an overload of racial trauma. So when we put them on medication around depression or anxiety, we're not really going to the root cause of what's causing the body to wither. So this is what there's a theory that was developed by an American sociologist, the withering framework, or weathering, which means it doesn't matter how strong you are. If you put a rock under a drip of water, eventually that rock will split. It doesn't matter how strong the rock is. If the drip is there every day, non-stop, all the time, eventually this big, massive rock will split. And it's how I like to think about racial fatigue. It doesn't matter how strong you are. If the injury is ongoing and never ending, eventually people crack. And this is why I think we see a lot of issues in our communities around mental health, around very high attempted suicides, around just, such a psychological, soul-wrenching fatigue with not knowing that, yes, I can cope today, but the drip is still on me. So, yeah, so I would say that's one of the biggest things that people talk about. But when I talk about Black people, especially Africans, I never like to talk just about the suffering because the beauty of our people is enormous. So the other thing that comes out of the research is the agency and the beauty and the resilience. We are hustlers in this world. Like, honestly,
Yeah.
we come into a difficult space and trust Africans to find a way to excel in our space. We are some of the most educated migrants. We are some of the most, in terms of home wealth, in terms of the migrant financial hold. We do really well, including in America. We go to some place, and because we're willing to do anything and everything, we will work those jobs that nobody wants to work. We will do the things that people do not want to do. We will put ourselves on the line. Like, our threshold for our resilience is absolutely remarkable, and also our capacity to let water slide, like water off a duck's back. We're like, I'm here for a reason. I'm here for my kids. I'm here for myself. So I also love to tell that story because I think that's what gives us an opportunity to survive, but also an opportunity to do really, really well. Every time I travel this country and every time I go, I'm often met with a community of Africans and the incredible stuff that they're doing, in spite of the racism, in spite of the drip every day on top of their forehead, in spite of all the challenges and doors being closed and people telling you you're less than. To see that amount of beauty and grace and resilience is nothing short of remarkable. And so that is a story that also needs to be told alongside all the other stories that I have told.
What a powerful balance you've brought in. I truly, truly love that. And yes, I often ask myself, this Black level of resilience is unmatched. And I wonder if those barriers were removed, if we didn't have to deal with racism, what could the Black community be? What could the Black race be?
I know. I ask myself the same question, Annie. I think, like, I put a spreadsheet every year for the times that I've needed to take off work or to lie down or to take sick leave simply because it gets too much. And sometimes I go, imagine if I had that time to just kind of not worry about those things or recover and do all these recovery practices. What could we be? Sometimes I wonder what books are unwritten, because of this? What ideas are undiscovered because we're out here trying to prove we're not criminals rather than thinking? But also, it's not even about doing sometimes, and it's also about what capacity for rest and joy would we have? Like just being able to go out there and play with your kids and just knowing it's all good. I don't have to prepare and give them the talk before we leave the house. I do not have to worry that if my black boys are playing on the street, that they might be, over-policed and hyper-policed and put under scrutiny. So it's not even just about the things that we could do, because we do a lot of the things in spite of. It's also the things we don't get to do, the joy, the resting, the absolute, it's almost like removing white noise from our brain and just having access to our entire capacity to just be. And that is the part that actually gives me the biggest grief, because I just go, it's almost like we can do, but it's what we don't get to do because of that heaviness, the resting part, the beauty part, the smiles that have been taken off our faces, the joy that has been taken off our bodies, the illnesses that we now have to fight because of this kind of trauma, the parents that are dying young, the families that don't get to enjoy the longevity of their families because a lot of Black communities die young, and we know racism is a killer. It's all those things. It's people who decide not to have children because then they're like, I'm not bringing a Black child into this world. It's those life-altering decisions of not just what we could do, but what we could be, I think is sad.
How do you keep going? How do you keep doing this work? And you do it in, as I said in the very, very beginning, you wear so many different hats. And I'm thinking of the psychotherapy one, holding that space, hearing these stories, watching the racial trauma, experiencing it yourself, studying it, researching it. How do you keep going? How do you keep doing this work?
I don't. I'll be very honest. It is hard and it is tough. I just put one leg in front of the other every day. That's it, one day at a time. Just one day at a time. That's how I keep going, So today we did a thing. Today I had a conversation with you. Today I'll write a paper and I'll do something else tomorrow. So I think that presence of mind into being able to focus on what I'm capable of having control over today is particularly important to me. I do not let myself completely drown into the things I do not have control over, because it can become very self-defeating. When I think about how big and how violent white supremacy is, sometimes I just go, what's the point of even doing this little research that I'm doing? When I look at what is happening in the world and I feel deflated, I cannot stay there for too long. I can bear witness. And often I choose not to look away because I want to bear witness. But I choose not to stay there too long, because the resulting outcome for that is that all of us are vanquished by the fatigue of doing this work. And then there's no one doing this work. I think Toni Morrison said in one of her book, the biggest strategy of racism is to distract. That's its biggest goal, is to distract. It distracts you from joy. It distracts you from your family, distracts you from relationships. It distracts you from yourself, because every day you're thinking about, I've got to print that receipt. It's distraction. It's just, you can't just enjoy shopping because you're constantly being distracted about how you're being perceived, right? So that is one. I try to stay in my circle of what I can influence, and anywhere I can influence is my research. That's what I'm doing. And with my clinic, that's what I'm doing. That's my small circle of influence. The second thing is that I get taken care of a lot. And, one day I'll come back and talk to you about this framework that I've just developed called the dignity framework. And one of the things that people talked to me about during that research project is our desire of Black people to be cared for and to be cared about. Because when you're always seen as the helper, the person who is always in service of others, people assume, oh, you don't need care, you don't need help. You're the helper, you're the person, you're the strong one, you're the strong Black person, you fill the gap. And so for me, decolonizing is rejecting this trope of being a strong Black person. Because Annie, I am weak, I am soft on the inside. I'm not particularly, stereotypically what people consider as strong, maybe emotionally, but I need care. And I'm very open about needing love and care and support from people who support me. So I'll never say I don't need help. That will never be me. If I need help, I will ask for it. Because like I said, there is no one who is self-made. Everybody is relying on a relationship to get them going somewhere. So for me, it's my partner, it's my very close girlfriends, it's the relationships that are very intentionally curated. People who are racially safe for me, people who are culturally safe for me, people who know me and know my heart, and they're big on forgiving me if I mess up, but also big on carrying me if I need help. Nobody can do this work alone. And so when we reject the separationist ideas of being an individual, we are also leaning into the joy of being supported by our community. Because when our community tells you you exist as an individual, it also means you don't have anywhere to go for support, for love, for care, and for being put back together. So I have a group of people who put me back together all the time, because this work breaks you and this work affects you. So if you do not have that, it can be very hard. And thirdly, I seek professional help. I'm a therapist in therapy, and that's important. So whether it's coaching and whether it's therapy, to help the professional help to contain you, because what this work can do is to spill you in all directions. The pain becomes too much. The grief becomes too much. Everything becomes too much. And so you need people to contain you and to put you back into a container to say, come back to yourself, and here are the skills for how you can do that. So, and I'm very, very, very connected to my community. So these are not necessarily my friends or my acquaintances, but I revel in the joys and the beauty of my community. I love to see you winning. I love to see Black people winning. I love to see them in all their spectrum, because they tell me often about their grief in my research and in therapy. I become very intentional about observing their joy and their beauty outside of that. So dancing and celebrating people, that's my intentional practice, because it's very easy for me to stay here because that's what people tell me every day. And so my intentional practice is to swing it, to intentionally look for joy and beauty and excellence and celebration and vulnerability within our community, to balance out how difficult the work can get sometimes.
And that is such a beautiful place to leave this conversation. There were so many more questions I wanted to ask. We didn't get there, but I do want to end by asking, do you ever see a world that is fully decolonized, living free from oppressive systems such as racism? Do you ever see a world like that?
I'm gonna be honest and say not now. because the world that we are living in has not reimagined an alternative. So we are trying to swim to the shore, right? But the river is still there and the ocean is still there. So I think what we need as a world is to reimagine an alternative to this, an alternative with this hyper-capitalism, an alternative to this, obsession with whiteness, an alternative to obsession with all these things which are not about expanding the individual. They're all about depleting the individual, depleting the planet, depleting our communities, depleting our relationships and our families, because that's what violent structures do. They deplete every aspect that gives power back to the individual. So with our current systems, Annie, in place, functioning under capitalism, functioning under neoliberal structures, functioning under, what we call post-coloniality, which I don't think we are post anything at all. I don't think it is possible for us to have that now. But in saying that, the world that we live in right now was our great-grandparents' wildest dreams, and they fought for that. And they fought their little part so that we can enjoy this little part. And so this is kind of like a call of action to do what we have to do now so that our children's children can say, we are living our great-grandparents' wildest dreams. So the job here is not to become good descendants, but to become good ancestors. So when we look at the ancestors who did the work for us, we can go, my God, our ancestors really put themselves on the line for us to have what we have. And so are we doing a job every day of becoming good ancestors? And I think it's when every person plays a role in becoming a good ancestors that we can reimagine a different world for our children. I don't think I'll be alive to see it, but that's actually why I work so hard, because that's what Ubuntu is. I do not have to sit under the shade of the tree that I planted. So it's planting as many trees that I can with the work that I do so that people that I do not even know, children that I haven't given birth to, have a place to sit down and rest. And for me, that's what I see as being in my control and how we can reimagine what we have right now. What about you? What do you do to rest, and what do you think we need to do to be able to get to where we need to get?
Oh, wow. Look at you spinning it back on
Yeah,
me.
I'm spinning. I'm putting you on the
Boy.
red hot seat.
What do I do? I have firm boundaries. I'm not always immersed in my work. I'm teaching, educating small online business owners on how to be more racially equitable. It is work that can be very depleting and exhausting.
Yeah.
Particularly as we see interests change. This work has really evolved and changed since there was this big desire to do this work 4 years ago. So there's been a massive change. So I have firm boundaries when I do this work. I also immerse myself a lot in joy, like when I am with my family, my husband, my kids, and that safe community, that safe space that you've created for yourself. I've created one that I absolutely love. And there's a lot of joy in it. I communicate a lot with my parents back home in Kenya. And so that brings me so much joy. I cook dinner with them, FaceTiming and all that sort of thing. So that's what I miss. My relationships are very, very, they mean a lot to me. And also, I am a woman of faith. I'm a Christian. And so my faith and standing on the word of God also brings me a lot of, it gives me the fuel to keep going, because I know that this is way bigger than me. And I know there's somebody who holds all of this in the palm of his hands. When it comes to a future, I love what you've said about, we are can we be good ancestors? It's not about what kind of descendants will we make or are we? It's about what kind of ancestors will we be and paving that way. You know, my mission with the work that I do is very much driven by the world I want my children to live in. And I've always said, if I can make their time here living in a different country where they're not the majority, where they face less obstacles than I did, where the road is just a little bit more smoother for them than it was for me, then I feel like I have played my role and I pass on the baton to them when their time comes, and they make that a little bit easier for the next generation and so on, so that who knows, maybe down the track, there might be that kind of world where racism is a thing of the past. And so that is my dream, my desire, and my hope.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think what would be the world be like without hope, eh? You know, I think if we lived without hope that it could be better, we wouldn't be doing the work that we're doing, you know? So the timeline differs in how we think this change is possible.
Yeah.
But I think the hope is there that it will be possible. But it's the collective work of all of us, I guess. Because the systems are made of individuals. The system doesn't function by itself without a person running it. So if all of us participate in doing those micro practices of change, I think it does move the wheel a bit further. You know, your children will have totally different experiences to what you've gone through since you came here, and they will do the same for the next generation, hopefully. And that's how we get, you know, to reimagine a different system and a different life for the people who come after us. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
I have to ask this last question that I ask every guest, which is, if fear was not a factor, how do you think you'd show up in your work?
It's a good question. If I wasn't afraid, what would I do? So let me answer that question in two parts, because part of me is unsure and part of me is thinking about it. So I already live a life that I consider a bit fearless, because nobody does this work without leaning into how vulnerable it is and how fearful it is, right? To be a Black woman constantly talking about white supremacy, to be talking about whiteness, to be talking about the injuries in our community, is to be in the vulnerable day in, day out. You know, so when people say, oh, Kathomi, you're so brave, I'm like, I'm not brave. I feel the fear and I just do it anyway. Because if I waited for the day when I wasn't afraid of the backlash of white supremacy, I wouldn't have the courage to do the work that I do. So I'm answering this by saying, I am not waiting for fearlessness, right? Because I think fear is also a gift. I am leaning into the fear and doing it anyway. But if hypothetically I was to live without fear, I actually don't think I would be doing the kind of work that I do. And I think I would probably be home, you know, I think I would be living a very different life. The work that I am doing now is actually a response to all the fear that I have felt, the fear of my community being racialized, you know, and the pain of everything that we've talked about. It's almost fear-based work, because we've been made to fear what it feels like to constantly toe the line, right? And so if I was to do something where I didn't think about fear, I think I'll be a musician, you know. I used to sing. I think I would be playing in a band somewhere. I don't think I'll be doing this kind of work at all. And I think I would have a totally different career, totally different life. And the reason why I'm struggling to visualize this at the moment is because that has been buried so far deep that I even didn't allow to think that that was even possible anymore. But, I'm curious to hear what what your other guests say, because that's interesting.
You should
Oh,
tune in
the
to all
other
the
thing before you
episodes.
answer that, if I wasn't fearful, I would probably have children. So I'm a person who've decided to be child-free by choice. Maybe that would change. But it's also part of that is fear. Fear of not being able to protect my children, fear of raising Black children, and just the fear of the catastrophe that is the world right now, and not feeling that I have what it takes to be able to protect them and look after them. So maybe that would be a different decision that I'd make if I wasn't afraid of what is in the world at the moment. And I think sometimes for me, the joy is not enough to counteract the realities of the fear in the world at the moment. So just wanted to add that because it's kind of more practical and less abstract.
Less abstract. Okay, I'll take that. That is a really, you've thought that through. You've given that a fair bit of thought. Kathomi Gatwiri, thank you so much for your time. I do not think you understand just how much incredible knowledge you've poured into this conversation over the past 1 hour. You are amazing. Keep
Thank
doing
you.
what you're doing. It is so needed. And your name is definitely going to go down in history as one of the household names here in Australia. I truly
Oh,
believe
that's
that
very
because of the
kind.
work that you're doing. It is needed, it is powerful, and I am so grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.